So let's give him a warm welcome here on the stage, Mr. Patrick Campbell.
What I want to kick things off with is just kind of taking a step back and understanding why a lot of us are in the subscription game. The beauty of the subscription model, and it doesn't really matter what you're selling, could be a software product, which isn't a lot of us, could be subscription e-commerce, which is most of us. But the beauty of the subscription model is that we're baking the relationship directly into how we make money. And it's the first commerce model in the history of mankind that actually does that. 150 years ago, we had situations where there was only one store in town, and that's basically where everyone had to go to get whatever they needed. Then over time, there was more and more competition. And if you think of like traditional retail, at least in the modern time, we were hoping and we were always praying that that customer would come back. But all of a sudden with the subscription and recurring revenue, not only do we get a lot of benefits from that compounding growth, but ultimately what it allows us to do is make sure that if we're keeping that customer happy, if we're giving them a lot of different value, we can actually keep that customer into the long term. Now with this came a lot of problems in particular, mainly because retention is a lot easier said than actually done. And so the thesis that we're going to be unpacking today is this whole concept that in the new subscription economy, it's something where you have to get closer and closer to that customer, and whoever actually gets close to that customer is ultimately the one who's going to win that customer. And if we don't, we're going to have a lot of retention problems, a lot of growth problems, and ultimately just a lot of business problems overall. And so we're going to unpack this, but just to give you a little bit of background on who the hell am I run a company called ProfitWell. Anyone heard of ProfitWell? Perfect. That is a good ego check right to the face. I love it. Well, you haven't heard of us, but we have a couple of different products. My personal background is in econometrics and math. I started my career, I worked at the US intelligence community, so I got a lot of fun stories over a hand grenade or a beer that we can talk about. But then I worked over at Google, and then I started ProfitWell after working in the e-commerce space for a company that was like a Blue Nile competitor. And at ProfitWell, what we do is we have a free subscription financial metrics product. So it plugs right into your billing system, Stripe, Zora, Braintree, Recharge, whatever you're using, and gives you free access to your cohorts, your MRR, your churn, all those kind of fun numbers. And the way that we actually make money is we use all of this data to basically understand where you're having problems, and then we ultimately sell you tools to help with your retention, particularly when it comes to things like credit cards, but also your active churn, and then ultimately with things like your pricing. Now, the big thing here is that was not really a great sales pitch. It wasn't meant to be. But at this point in time, we're actually sitting on about 20% of the entire subscription market's data, because 20% of the market's using one or more of our products, which gives us a ton of information that we can actually study and a ton of information that you're going to see in the rest of this presentation. And so when we unpack this thesis about, hey, the market is getting denser and denser, it's getting harder and harder to grow that business, let alone retain those customers, it's coming from a lot of the data that we're going to see and ultimately a lot of that context. So this is what we're going to unpack today. There's going to be a lot of fun information here, and so don't be afraid of getting it all in. We're going to make sure that everything is shared, but we're going to learn basically what we can do to retain those customers. Sound good? You guys pumped? Are you really pumped? All right, let's do it. All right, so first, why? Why now? Why is retention so important? You got a bunch of different tracks, a bunch of different people talking about this, a bunch of different blog posts, all kinds of stuff going on. Well, the reason that this is so important now is because the entire market has changed. In particular, there's so much competition out there. And what I mean by that is when we look at subscription e-commerce companies in particular, and we track them over time, what we found is that this is one market and one vertical within the larger subscription economy where you actually don't beat a lot of competitors, you attract competitors over time. So the data that you're looking at here, you're essentially looking at on the far left, this is the first 6 months of a particular company. Then all of a sudden the 7 to 12 months of a particular company, and then all of a sudden you're looking at 13 to 36 months, and essentially you're starting out with about 2 competitors, and all of a sudden you're ramping up to double-digit numbers of competitors because the entry into the market has actually become not easy, but easier than it once was before. Essentially what's happened is when you have a little modicum of success, if you're delivering food in a box for the first time and people are like, oh my God, this is amazing, this is brand new, all of a sudden they're like, well, I can do that. I can go figure that out at scale. And all of a sudden you're attracting a lot of this competition because the barriers to entering the market have actually gone down. Now what's kind of fascinating about this is that our customers have benefited immensely. I don't know about you guys, but I get subscription toilet paper delivered to my house. I know that sounds a little ridiculous, but I love it. It's great. I don't have to go to the store anymore. I live in Boston, which is not fun to like go to a CVS. It's great though. Now, our customers have so many different options. There's so many different things that they can have, which is awesome. But from a business perspective, we've lost a lot of our power. So anyone here been in the game for, let's say, more than 10 years? Building companies in this space? How about more than 5 years even? A lot of newbies in the room. That's super interesting. Well, not to sound like old man Winter here, but back in the day, you used to be able to get Google ads for a penny a click. You used to get 90% open rates on your email newsletters because who doesn't open their mail, right? That was the old mindset of building a company. But when all this competition came into play, all of a sudden we're all running ads, we're all having content, we're all focusing on Instagram, we're all doing all of these different things. And what that's caused is an immense amount of density in the market. And we see this in particular when we look at things like customer acquisition costs. So the cost to acquire a customer, particularly in subscription e-commerce, is up about 100% in the past 5 years. This is some data you're looking at of about 1.6 thousand different subscription companies. The top line is subscription e-commerce. So that customer that might have cost you $100 5 years ago, that customer is now costing you $200 today because of all that density that's happened in the market. Now, I know we have some marketers in the room, some good growth hackers, right? And you might be looking at this data and you might be thinking, oh, I'm really, really good at my job, so like, this doesn't matter, Patrick, right? Well, the problem on the flip side is that the stuff that we are offering isn't as novel anymore, isn't as valuable as it once was, where the actual value in the products that we're producing is down by about half in the last 5 years. So it used to be something that was novel, it used to be something that was really cool. Oh, these are some premium beauty products, these are some premium jewelry, we can rent the runway, all these different pieces. But what's actually happened is that when you look at things like niche food products, fitness and wellness, clothing and beauty, and there's a whole host of different types of products that we could throw this data against, you're actually noticing that that product that you might have been able to sell for, $50 a month, it's actually lost about half its value in the eyes of the actual customers. So we're in this situation where things are more and more expensive because we're not getting brand new marketing channels that are opening up every single year or every single quarter like they used to be. But you're also in a situation where it's getting tougher and tougher to defend your value because there's just a lot more competition, there's a lot more products out there that are vying for those consumers' time. And what's really kind of fascinating is that our customers are super ungrateful. Not ungrateful in the sense of they don't like you, but when we look at NPS scores, anyone heard of Net Promoter Score? Right? It's a measure of customer satisfaction. You've seen these surveys before, but when we look at NPS score, it's down 80% in the past 5 years. So what you're looking at here is about 2,000 different companies and their actual scores, not their aggregated scores. And 5 years ago, kind of overall, you looked at about 34, but for subscription e-commerce, it was a little bit better because, it was novel, there was higher brand quality and brand equity there. But across the board, it's down. And I don't think anyone's gonna stand up and say, like, products are worse today than they were 5 years ago, right? We have gotten better at producing our products. We have gotten better at our customer relationships. But the market is just continuing to get denser and denser. So everything's amazing, and people are happy. It's not that no one is happy, but they're not as happy as they once were because we've lost a lot of that novelty in the things that we've produced. And what's kind of fascinating is it gets worse. So all of these things are happening in the market. You can't control the market, right? The issue is that when we've looked at this as operators, as founders, as executives at these companies, when we've looked at this, we haven't changed how we do business. And that's affected us in a couple of different ways. So first up, what we have to realize is that our playbook, our primary playbook for growing our businesses is acquire more customers over and over and over again. That's where we focus most of our time, that's where we focus most of our energy. And just for an interesting experiment here, what percentage of a company's budget do you think currently goes to acquisition in the subscription e-commerce space? Any guesses? 80? It's my brother right there, probably. Not my actual brother, but my soul brother there. 20%? 63%. That's a median. So that means half the group, at least in this data set, there's a couple thousand companies, is basically spending more than that, and half the group is spending less. But it's what we're addicted to, because obviously you need to acquire customers, right? The issue is that you have multiple different layers of growth when you have a subscription business, and a lot of us aren't exploiting the other two major growth levers, particularly when it comes to monetizing your customer base and also retaining that customer base. So we built this really interesting model where we took a couple, I think it was about 1,000 companies, and we basically isolated their growth metrics. And we looked at if we improved each of their different growth levers, their acquisition, their monetization, and retention, by the same relative amount, what would be the impact on their revenue? And what we found is that if you increase your acquisition by about 1%, you used to be able to get a 5% boost in your revenue in aggregate for these 1.6 thousand companies. But over time, that's actually been squeezed because of the other data sets that we saw. Now, if you improve your monetization, so your average revenue per customer, or your retention, your actual retention rate, your churn rate, your cancellation rate by about 1%, which admittedly, those are harder 1% to get than just spending more money, this is the impact that you'll get on revenue. So we're living in a world where you obviously need to acquire customers. You're probably still going to spend 60% of your budget on acquisition-based activities inside your company. But if we're really honest with how much time and how much money we're actually spending in the world of our monetization or our retention, probably realize that we can spend a little bit more time here and actually get some bigger gains within our business instead of fighting the exact same game that everyone else in the room and everyone else in your space is actually doing. So your monetization, your retention, they have 4 to 8x the impact of focusing on your acquisition. Again, you gotta acquire customers, but you gotta spend other time on monetizing them properly and ultimately retaining them. Now, I said it gets worse before. It gets even more worse. More worse? Worser? That's not grammatically correct. Thank you. You're a great audience member. So it gets worse. So we're not doing a lot of our research. Who here is doing market research or customer research of any kind? Right? Not a ton of the room, right? The problem is that worked out really, really well 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, because you could basically get good velocity on your ads to figure out, hey, what messages were working, what messages weren't working. But ultimately, what's happening is a lot of us means we're not offering the right product. And when I say product, it's not only the physical thing that you might be selling, but it's also the positioning of your product. And so to introduce this, I have to introduce a new model that you probably haven't seen before. But for any MBAs in the room, it's a nice little 2x2. And when you think of any product, whether it's a cup of coffee, piece of software, a box of the month, whatever it is, you have 2 axes of value. The first axis of value is the actual attributes or the features of that product. So these are things for a cup of coffee like the taste, the country of origin, the temperature. And then the other axis, which is a little bit more obvious, is the actual willingness to pay for that cup of coffee. Now, what we can do is using some methodologies that we've developed or some methodologies that have been developed for the past decades by psychologists and economists, is we can survey this entire room and we can figure out that for a cup of coffee, this room mostly cares about taste. That's the most important feature to this room. Not everyone cares about that as the most important, but most of you care about it. And we can find out that you're pretty indifferent about the temperature, and only the hipsters in the room really care about country of origin. Most of you don't care as much about that. Now, we can then cross-reference this data with willingness to pay information. And we can find out that those of you who the #1 feature for a cup of coffee is taste, you're willing to pay about 20 to 30% more. Those of you who really care about temperature, you're willing to pay about 20% less. And there's not a lot of you, but the ones who do really care about the country of origin, you're willing to pay about 40% more. Now, where does this come back to the statement I made about offering the wrong product or positioning the wrong product? Well, if I find a particular attribute of my product that is really, really high value relative to the other attributes and also has high willingness to pay, then I have a differentiable feature. If I find some sort of aspect of my product that has low value but high willingness to pay, that might be an add-on. Something that's high value from an attribute perspective but low willingness to pay is a core feature or a core aspect of the product. And then finally, my favorite quadrant, trash. Okay? Now, we went out to about 1,300 different leaders of either merchandising, product, basically the people who decide what is being offered with the product. And we asked them, for their last N features, their last N attributes of a product, for their last N basically emphasis for a particular product on their positioning, where do you think it falls on this quadrant after making sure that they understood what these quadrants actually meant? And this is what your product leaders said. So they think they're offering really, really high amounts of value, They think they're positioning things in a really, really high value way. And they ultimately think that they're doing exactly what they should be doing, right? We then went out to about 1.2 million different customers of these products, using some of the methodologies I referenced to basically figure out where is actual value for these customers of these products. And this is what they said. So this is what we think is working. And this is how our customers view it, right? And we're not doing the research to figure this out, right? And the reason that this should be so scary, maybe, is that when you think about your business, and we go back to the core of what a subscription is, which is that relationship, if you don't understand who those customers are, if you don't understand what you're offering them, what they care about, what they don't care about, ultimately what they value, what they don't value, and even what they're willing to pay for that value is, it's extremely difficult to create an efficient funnel that is going to create a market or a product or a business where you're going to keep those customers coming back. And it's extremely difficult to do this. I'm not saying that this is so easy and you can just wave a magic wand and get this perfect, but if you're not doing any of this effort, it becomes really, really difficult to complain why you might be struggling with growth, or you might not be getting the growth that you would expect. So what should you take away here besides I'm an asshole? No. So the market has become dense, and it's because of our success. So we can pat ourselves on the back, it's amazing, but is also, making us struggle a bit here. We're focusing on the old way of growing, particularly when it comes to building these businesses, and ultimately we need to evolve on what we focus on in particular for growth. And for the rest of the time here, I want to make you not hate me. Does everyone feel terrible? Who feels great? Your business is doing awesome then, right? Yeah. All right. So, how do we fix this? You guys want to fix this? Yeah? We can just wallow in the darkness for the rest of the time. I'm okay with that too. No? All right, let's fix this. So it's really hard in the remaining time to go through an entire framework on how to fix retention. So what I'm going to focus on a couple of higher level things that'll probably take a little bit extra work, and then focus on a bunch of tactical things that you can go back into your business and make changes right away in order to start improving retention. The ultimate thing you got to think about though is really breaking down what retention is in your particular business. So when you think about retention, and meaning revenue protection within your business, it's really good to understand exactly what we're talking about. And for some of you, this is going to be super, super basic. It's a basic math formula, right? So you have a bunch of customers, and then there's a couple of different ways that you can basically influence your overall retention, especially your revenue retention within your business. You have a first lever here, which is actual payment cancellations, meaning these are people who cancel because of payment failures. There's 130 plus different reasons why a credit card will fail, and most of you have credit card-based businesses, and they're all over the place. We're going to talk about payment failures in a bit. You have active cancellations. These are people who are actively saying, I no longer want your product because I didn't like the support, I didn't like the assortment I got, I didn't like the story, I just can't use it anymore, a whole host of reasons. And that's essentially your gross churn. And then there's expansion revenue here, which is basically getting more money from your existing user base. So it's a math formula. And when we think about it as a math formula, all of a sudden we realize these are the three basic pillars that we can use to basically influence our overall retention. And so we're going to go through two of these big pillars and then briefly talk about the third one in order to make sure that you have some of those tactical pieces as well as some of those strategic pieces. And that's why I call it popcorn time. So not everything's going to be super relevant to every single person in the room, but you're going to get something here to think about within your business. The first one here is optimizing those active cancellations. So these are people who no longer want to use your product. And unfortunately, there isn't a silver bullet. Going back to that central thesis of why you're in business and why a subscription makes sense, you got to do your customer development, your customer research. You have to understand which customers are great for you, which customers are not so great. This is worth a whole 45-minute plus kind of talk to go through, so we're not going to go too deep here. But ultimately, there's no tactic that's going to fix the wrong type of market you're going after or the wrong type of product that you're offering to that market. So that's where the bulk of this is going to come from. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where that takes a lot of work. Now, assuming you don't have time for that work, or assuming that work's going to take years to kind of figure out as you're building your business, there's some different tactical things that we can focus on. So after you've kind of understood your customer, or if you're on the journey of understanding your customer, the first thing that a lot of you aren't thinking enough about is longer term contracts. And we've seen this in the data over and over again. When we look at particular businesses who have a higher proportion of either long-term contracts or even getting into annual contracts, which is a little rarer in this space, but it's one of those things that is possible depending on your product, we notice that their churn is dramatically lower. Their active cancellations are dramatically lower. So here's the data that I'm referring to. So on the left-hand side here, you have companies that have 0% of their contracts as annual contracts. As you increase the number of longer-term contracts, essentially that churn rate is going down. Now this should stand to reason, right? So someone who has less invoices, less decisions that they have to make within that term, theoretically what that's going to mean is essentially there's going to be less cancellations. Now it's not going to be silver bullet and solve everything, but it's one of those things where you can optimize this relatively quickly within your business, because most of us, we ask for a longer term when they sign up and maybe once a year, when in reality we should be decoupling that opportunity to actually get them on a longer term plan by basically understanding when is that sweet spot where you can go and get that person who's seen the value and then sign them up for a longer term. So I'm going to share this because we're not going to go through this entire example, but here's an example that we've seen work really well. Basic plain text emails, identifying when that user's really optimized for that annual plan in this particular case, having that email go out, and then making it a really, really slick experience in particular, because a lot of you don't have an interface that people are going to log into every single day. And with that, they can one click through this particular email and essentially upgrade or update their term length, right? So this is something that you can go back to your business, you can run just a simple test. You don't necessarily have to build out the infrastructure for them to be able to do this one click, but it's something that you really, really focus on, because at the end of the day, just getting that extra month or those extra 2 to 3 months in your LTV can mean the difference between a business that's failing and a business that's doing really, really well in the subscription e-commerce space. So that's something that's nice and tactical. Now, things that are a little bit harder here, and these ones take just as long as basically having good research around your customers, are things involving support and brand. So what's kind of interesting is that in a lot of our products, depending on how strong our brand or our design aesthetic is, we might not necessarily have a huge differentiator versus the competition in a lot of our spaces. But what we're noticing is that support and brand in particular, at least those individuals who have customers who have a positive affinity for their customer support or their company's brand, they're seeing much, much better retention rates and much, much higher willingness to pay rates. So what we looked at here, first on the support axis, is we wanted to understand, and I'm curious, any guesses in the audience, how many companies out there do you think look at support as core to their overall product experience? Any guesses, like out of 10? 50%? Pretty good guess, a little low, right? Not a lot of people think about this as an actual differentiator, but if you have a very commoditized space or a very competitive space, this is one of the easiest differentiators to have. And the reason this is particularly important is because if we go back to our quadrant here, what we're noticing is that support or good support is basically trending towards something that's just kind of expected or just something that's core. And when we actually did a huge study where we went out and we asked a bunch of different customers their perception of a company's support and then compared the retention rates of those companies, what we found is that those companies that had a very, very positive or just even a basic positive perception, that's the top line, basically had much, much better revenue retention than those folks who were basically had neutral customers in terms of support or had negative perceptions of that company's support. Now, what's also kind of fascinating is that brand is something that's super important here as well. So how many of you have, or how many companies do you think have a brand strategy right now? Even a basic document that just says this is what our brand strategy is. Any guesses? 5? 5 out of 10? 2 out of 10? It's 4 out of 10, a little better than support. This is super important because it not only increases the willingness to pay, like I mentioned, but also the retention. So what you're looking at here is about 500,000 different data points here, and it's mixed between a lot of different verticals, includes software, but also subscription e-commerce, is that essentially those individuals who have a positive or a very positive perception of a brand, their willingness to pay is typically about 20 to 35% higher than those folks who simply have a neutral perception. And this is where content comes into play. This is where differentiating your brand really comes into play. And ultimately, this is something that's going to take some time. It's not like you can wave a magic wand and all of a sudden have a great brand. But it's one of those things where it is something that you have to think about because of how commoditized this space and a lot of your spaces end up being. So ultimately, great support, great brand, higher retention, and even higher willingness to pay. So going a little bit deeper here, tactically, let's talk about credit card failures. Who here has a problem with credit cards? A few of you. Who here thinks they have a problem, but they're not sure? Because a lot of you don't look at this, and it's something that's super, super important to get a handle on. Just to give you a little bit of a perspective in terms of some data, typically of your churn, your cancellations, your money that's leaving, 20 to 40% of it is typically coming from some sort of payment failure. And this includes basically netting out anyone who gets recovered. This is actually the number of people who are basically leaving. And here's some data to kind of show that. This is splitting out B2B and in B2C. In D2C, it's actually a little bit higher, mainly because there's higher volumes of credit cards and you don't really get economies of scale. And what's kind of scary about this is we're only recovering 3 out of 10 of these folks. So if 10 people go through a payment failure, we're only recovering about 3 of them within the first 90 days that they go past that payment failure. So it's a really, really big issue in a lot of our companies. And we don't really think about it because it's not really core to our product. And ultimately, it's not something that we're like, oh, we'll worry about it later. We'll just send some emails. The issue is that a lot of these customers are actually able to be gotten back, mainly because they're canceling not just because their payment failed, but they already were there. They already have felt the brand. And there's a world where you can actually get them back by basically treating this entire channel as a marketing channel. And so we're going to go through a couple of tactics here. This is the data of recovery rates. As you'll notice, as you get into be a bigger and bigger brand, even if you're doing 50 million a year or more, you're not really getting any economies of scale, which is kind of interesting. So let's go a little bit deeper here on treating these folks as a marketing channel. And at this point in time, I've learned more about credit cards than I've ever wanted to in my life. We've studied the metadata from about 900 million different credit cards, which is not something I ever thought of when I was a child and wanting to grow up and do something with data here. But let's break this down. So the thing to kind of keep in mind, it's a game of inches. So some of you have really good engineering teams, really good data science teams. Some of you, you're like, I can't even imagine having someone with a data science background on our team. That's totally okay, but there's still some gains to be made with relatively little amounts of work because solving this payment problem or this cancellation problem is actually a really good game of inches. So to kind of take a big step back here, you have to think about what to do before the failure actually happens. A lot of folks, they don't really do anything. They might send a pre-done email, and we'll talk about that in a second. But really, there's a lot of things you can do before this basically becomes a problem to actually solve the problem right at the outset. So what we typically recommend doing, if you're a little bit more advanced, you can start to study your own data. So for example, if you have a larger international kind of swath of customers, you're probably going to run into a lot of false fraud flags that happen, where all of a sudden, I can just tell you right now, if you have a customer in Finland and you're a US-based company, you have a 3x higher chance of a false fraud flag just because of the banks over there. And there's dozens and dozens of examples of that you can go through. If you have a lot of debit cards that keep failing, you can actually look at that pattern and get ahead of it because you can see, oh, this person keeps failing over and over again. Now, the way to actually get at that particular person is right now, for some of you, actually having some sort of in-app notifications. And I know a lot of you don't have apps that people necessarily log into, but again, it's that game of inches. So you can set up intercom, you can set up your own message, but you want to get some of these folks back who might be logging in to update their subscription or to just check out what's going on with their billing. And in some rare cases, you can use an email. And I use rare cases here because of its data point that I'm going to show you in a second. The most obvious one here is expiration tracking. So you can actually see when a credit card is about to expire pretty easily, no matter the payment processor you're using. And this is something where you can kind of get ahead, again, using in-app notifications for some of those folks who might be logging in, and then really rare instances using some emails. And the reason I keep kind of harping on emails is because I kind of recommend out of hand, if you don't have a chance to study your actual data, do not use pre-dunning emails. So these are emails that you send out that says, hey, your credit card's about to expire. The reason is in studying those 900 million credit cards and those transactions is we found that when you use a pre-dunning email, it actually increases churn by about 11 to 18% on the active side. So you're reminding that customer again that there's going to be some sort of a payment. Maybe Amex was already going to pick up, or even MasterCard was going to pick up the failed payment. And all of a sudden you've gotten in front of that rather than just kind of letting things kind of take its course and basically making sure that you're kind of fighting that game of inches. So be very, very careful with emails before the point of failure. Now after the point of failure here, this is where there's some basic things that you can go into your current billing system and basically make sure there's some sort of smart retries happening within your business. So if you're using Stripe, Braintree, Recurly, Zori, Recharge, Bold, whatever you're using, there's some sort of system that you can set up to make sure that they're actually retrying those credit cards. Now what I will say, again, if you have a little bit more advanced technology inside your company, a lot of these billing systems, their retries are basically pretty equal. Now there's some differences between some different verticals, some different size companies, but ultimately what we recommend is if you have a little bit more firepower is to actually decouple the retry logic from the automated systems within your billing system. And the reason for this is that what we found in studying all these credit cards is that there's different things that you should do depending on your business. So if you're a D2C business, which most of you in the room are, one of the best times to retry a credit card, 12:01 a.m. Pacific, on the 1st or the 15th of the month. Any guesses why? It's payday, right? And oftentimes what you'll notice is that some of those companies, the billing systems, they're not actually doing that exactly because they're studying all of their data, which includes D2C, B2B, all types of different companies. Now, again, if you don't have a lot of firepower internally to study this stuff, just use whatever the billing system has. It's better than nothing. Now, the bulk of your recovery is going to come from email and a bit of in-app notifications. Email is going to be the lion's share of this, and there's some things you should keep in mind when it comes to email. Don't use stylized emails. Now, I know that's a little bit cringy to some folks in the room because you're like, my brand is so pretty, I have all these really beautiful pictures, I want to use that to get these customers back. The problem is that very personalized plain text emails tend to work the best in terms of deliverability, but ultimately in terms of the actual recovery rate. So here's just an example of an email we've seen work really, really well. It's super straightforward. It's the first email that you send, and it's kind of nice. It's not bill collectory. That's also the worst thing you can do is be very bill collectory up front. It's just hey, it looks like the subscription didn't go through. I don't know why it happened. Credit cards are weird, right? Just update your credit card. It'll be awesome, right? I'm being flippant, hopefully to show a dramatic point. But the idea is that you're basically being super straightforward with that customer. And then over time, you might kind of turn the screws a little bit, get a little bit less nice as you get closer to the end of that grace period that you have. And are just hey, now it's unsuccessful. You turned up the language a little bit here. Now, a really important point here, again, if you don't have a lot of firepower internally to optimize here, just do the basics. We recommend 4, maybe 5 emails, but normally you want to kind of test it a little bit. But if you have a little more firepower internally, you really should be testing this stuff. Because we've noticed that very small tests can have very, very large impacts on open rates, completion rates, et cetera. Things like the time of day you send, similar to the retries. Normally in D2C, the afternoon is probably the best time to send the email, mainly because people are kind of burnt out at work in the afternoon and they want something, they're going back to their personal side. Some other things like the distance between sends. So sending one email one day and then the next email the next day, you'll see some good gains there versus kind of spreading those emails out. And then even the copy, right? Make sure you play with it, make sure you kind of make sure it's your brand, but ultimately it's some things that you can do very, very similar to a marketing email on the other side of the business. The other thing you can do here, I don't know if I put this in here, if you have a multilingual base, localized emails work really, really well. I would recommend if you have 10 to 15% of your base that's outside of your main language, that's probably the time to actually localize or internationalize those emails as well. Now, from a technological standpoint, this will take a little bit of extra work, but I think it's super, super valuable. Because most of you don't have login experiences, make sure that someone can update their email without having to log in and go through a bunch of hoops in order to give you their credit card. And the main reason is because our billing settings pages are probably the worst designed pages on our websites. It's okay, they're terrible for everyone just because we don't focus a lot of time there. So what you can do with some relative ease, and there's some out-of-box solutions that allow you to do this, is basically once they click through an email, you can have the experience basically be on your home page and very securely, following PCI compliance, have them fill this out and then basically update and save, and it reduced the friction completely for that user to update that payment information, especially if it's mobile optimized as well. This is another big thing that we notice works out really, really well to increase that recovery rate. And then finally, locking customers out. You would be amazed at how many companies don't cancel customers when they stop paying. Like when they actually actively cancel the subscription, like that's really obvious. But some of you, probably a non-zero amount of you, there's some leakage in your business because of payments are being treated a little bit different, or your payment failures are being treated a little bit differently than an active cancellation. Especially if you're not a product that's high cost. High cost, this shows up really quickly because you're like, whoa, 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 this person didn't pay for this. But if you have a different model, like making sure that you actually lock them out, and when they log back in, if they're wondering where their items are, where something is, they get a really obvious like, hey, we don't have your payments, so you can update. And this is also a really good thing to make sure that like you're not canceling out their account. Like basically they might come back 6 months later, and then it's like, hey, we can basically restart where we were, essentially by filling out the payment information. Cool. So payment failures, probably one of the highest impact levers you have right now, and it's a hidden part of your business because you're probably focusing on all the other obvious aspects. But this is probably a pretty big piece of where you're losing customers right now. Cool. So again, knowing your customer, it's the number one thing. I know I'm glossing over it, but it's super, super important. That's how you're going to truly solve retention. From a tactical standpoint, you can play with term, your support, and your brand, and then ultimately looking at your payment failures. It's probably one of the biggest levers that you're not really attacking right now. And then the final piece in terms of expansion revenue, add-ons. Add-ons I know have been in this space for quite some time, but a lot of us aren't really thinking about our add-on strategy. It's one of the most underutilized ways to essentially expand the revenue per user. And a lot of us, we just haven't even thought of something to provide those existing customers, or even provide those new customers to basically expand that average revenue per customer. So it's something to kind of think about out of the gate. Cool? Everyone tired? I was here to wear you out. No? You guys pumped? You still hate me? We good? No? All right. Well, again, remember, it's about that relationship. So you have to understand that relationship, you have to nurture that relationship, and you ultimately have to make sure it's a symbiotic relationship between that customer and you as a business. In terms of next steps, make sure you're putting in the work. More than happy to do retention audits. It's something that we can do really, really easily through ProfitWell. This is my email address if you want the data. We've written a ton of books on everything from pricing all the way to churn and retention, so happy to share those. But I'll also be sticking around the rest of the conference and excited to have some good conversations. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Patrick.
One question?
Sure. We can do one question.
Does anyone have one question? You're very urgent. You're very anxious. What's your question? Yeah. Got it. Good question. So the question was, just because we didn't have the mic, is when you have those plain text emails, should those come after the payment attempts, those 3 payment attempts? So really you want to do this in a way that's kind of together. So it's hard to see here, but basically you might have a situation where you shouldn't send an email until you've retried the credit card, because if you can get them back on a retry, why send them an email? But in this case, you want to basically test that out a little bit. So you don't want to do them in a serial way, you want to do them in parallel. So sometimes what people will do if they don't have a lot of time or effort, what they'll do is they'll just set it up so that the email just goes after the retry. So it'll go retry, email, etc. Really, you want to break those up because there's different times of the day, days of the week, and stuff like that you want to do the retries. But great question. Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Patrick. Round of applause for Patrick, please.
Thanks, guys.